Hi, my name is Elle Billing. I am a chronically ill queer femme, and I'm tired. I'm here this episode and every episode to dig at the roots of our collective fatigue, explore ways to direct our care in compassionate and sustainable ways, and harness creative expression to heal ourselves and our world. And welcome to Hoorf, Radical Care in a Late Capitalist Hexscape. My guest today is Jen Blair. Jen Blair was born and raised in Utah, where she met and married her husband of almost 30 years. They graduated together from Brigham Young University. Jen graduated with a degree in elementary education. Jen's early adult years were spent moving around the country to support her husband's education and raising 4 children. Just over a decade ago, Jen's oldest child shared the information that he is gay. This launched a new season of learning and advocacy work for her and for her family. When not practicing yoga or reading, she's often having lively conversations with strangers on the internet. I'm excited to have Jen here on the podcast today. Welcome. Well, hi Jen. Welcome to Hoorf.
Hello, how are you?
I'm pretty well today. How are you doing?
Good. Actually, having a good morning.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. I guess it is still morning there. We just hit the noon hour, Central Time. My dad's home for lunch. He played with the dog a little bit. It's our typical noon routine. The dog knows when it's noon and she starts watching for Papa so she can play ball.
To come excited for Grandpa to show up.
My dog is probably the most routine person in the family, besides my dad, of course. But like in the morning, she gets me up to get fed, and then she wakes me up again when she thinks I've slept long enough. And then at noon, she watches for my dad, and then in the evening, she watches for my dad.
Like a little babysitter.
She is. It's really nice.
That's awesome.
I wouldn't have as much of a routine, I don't think, if I didn't have a working breed of a dog.
That's awesome.
She has no cows, so we are her cows.
I love that.
So the first question that I ask all my guests is, how have you received care this week?
When I read the question earlier, I was actually trying to think about the ideas of self-care or like receiving care from other people. And I really kind of just focused on the self-care part because I have been trying to be so mindful the last couple of years about things that keep me moving forward in healthy ways. And I try to consistently do those. But I've discovered with my ADHD that I get bored of these sorts of things pretty quickly. And so self-care for me, when people say things like, try to drink enough water, try to get outside, try to move every day, absolutely true. Love those things. Try to do those things. But if I try to go for a walk every day for the rest of my life, it does not turn into self-care. It turns into a task and a job, and I start to hate it.
It's a chore.
Yep. Yeah. So recently I've been trying to be really thoughtful about the fact that my brain doesn't work that way, and try to do little self-care things for about 20 to 30 days and then totally ditch the first one and move to a next one. So like maybe for 20 days, I will really focus on getting enough water. And then maybe the next month, I will really focus on reading some novels that just take me out of myself. And then maybe the next month, I'm obsessed with puzzles, and I'll just do a lot of puzzles to give myself time to breathe and think. But when I try to pick a thing and do it forever, it's not going to work. It's not going to work for me because I'm going to get bored. I'm going to be like, oh, got to do a puzzle again. And it becomes not self-care, where if I wait for 8 months and then say March is going to be puzzle month because it's going to be yucky outside. And then I get excited and I look forward to it, and it really feels like self-care. So as I get older, I'm kind of thinking about these sorts of things more intentionally.
That's really cool. I like that a lot. Just even exercising that kind of reflection and self-knowledge is a form of self-care too, because you have to know yourself to be able to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
That's really neat. My sister's actually really into puzzles and reading, but never at the same time. So she'll go through and read, 20 books in a very short amount of time. And then she'll get into puzzles and put together these big, complicated 1,000-piece puzzles and do a bunch of them. She had spinal surgery a number of years ago. during her recovery, she just couldn't do much. She was sitting at home recovering, and so she
Yeah.
just did a bunch of puzzles.
I just recently had surgery myself. I had 6 weeks that I needed to be down, and that was for sure a puzzle phase so
Yep.
that I didn't lose my mind being trapped.
I had to laugh a little bit to myself when you said, you'll focus on water for like a month and then move on to something else. And all I could think of was like you were reading books, but like really dehydrated.
It's not funny because it's true.
Or it is funny because it's true. No, I'm the same.
It's not gonna happen for me if I try to make like how people, like healthy people, weight loss people are always like, you pick a goal that you can do for the rest of your life. And I'm like, that goal doesn't exist. Like that is not how my brain works.
Napping. That's mine. That's the thing I can do for the rest of my life. I will always be able to nap because I am never rested.
Even knowing that about yourself, like mentally in your head, be like, wow, look at me napping. I'm taking such good care of myself.
Yep.
Where someone else might be like, I have napped every day this week. I am such a loser. I'm so lazy. Or those horrible stories we tell ourselves. Like
Right.
knowing that it's self-care is like a really great thing for you.
Yeah. It's like, no, naps are so good for you. Like,
Yeah.
way to not grind.
And to do it guilt-free.
Yep.
Allows you permission. I love that.
And now it's to the point with my nap routine where I say, well, Mom, I did 2 things today. And she goes, let me guess, it's nap time. I said, it sure is.
I've done 2 things.
I've done 2 things. One of them was showering. And
sometimes that's the one thing.
Oh my gosh. It's so much effort. Anything, well, because I have to wash my hair, right? And I have fibromyalgia and my arms get really fatigued. And so it's like, well, I showered today. That was one thing on the to-do list. And now I have to recover. And then I'll do one more thing and then it'll be nap time.
I think it sounds lovely. Like you've mapped it out perfectly.
Yeah, it works for now. Like it's a workable structure.
I like that. That's all what we're all trying to figure out, right? Like what works? How can we make this sustainable?
Yeah. And my dog knows when it's nap time and she gets all excited and her little butt wiggles and she's like, oh, it's nap time.
That's awesome. I tend to like overdo and then underdo. And then overdo, like putting in the 20-hour days, trying to get something amazing accomplished and then burn out and do nothing. I love this like pace of like do one thing, take a nap, do one thing.
Yeah. I've been the workaholic perfectionist person and then I got sick and I just can't do that anymore. So napping is my mantra now.
I love it.
You and I met, I don't even know how long ago it was, but it was in Idaho and probably through Mama Dragons or something adjacent to it.
Originally, we met because you did a TED Talk.
Oh, it was my TED Talk.
And my youngest did a TED Talk at that same event. So that's actually when we met.
Right. I'm glad you remembered because I didn't.
I remember because your TED Talk was something about like the thumb of my
thumb of my leg.
Thumb of my leg. I was close.
Yeah. It was about it was about teaching like trilingual kids at the deaf school.
Yeah, like the genius of how linguistics is working in the brains of brilliant little children. I remember.
Yes, and your youngest kid's TED Talk was about having an oldest sibling who came out as gay while you guys were active in the LDS church and giving out free hugs.
Yeah, they spoke about at the time it was about allyship. They've since come out themselves, which would change things a little bit, but at the time they were 8.
Yeah.
And we're talking about being an ally like a kid on the playground and stuff, and some of the horrible things that they were hearing, and primarily how they felt like all of these little friends of theirs were missing out because they had been introduced to the queer community and they loved it. They loved the people and the color and enthusiasm and excitement. And none of these peers of theirs that were saying inaccurate things on the playground were able to enjoy that same colorful existence that they had been exposed to.
Yeah, I remember. Great speaker for 8. I remember that.
Yeah, we don't share it very often anymore because they don't have the same name.
Oh, right. No, I get it. Yeah.
And so it's, a little triggering for them to have an old name blasted on everything.
So I did mention Mama Dragons because I think it was probably then the reverse. Through you, I found out who the Mama Dragons were.
Probably. I was the only one in that area at that time.
Yeah. I guess we can do this out of order or in any of 2 ways. You can talk about your family or your personal journey with your eldest coming out and how the Mama Dragons played into that, or you can explain who the Mama Dragons are and then talk about your family in relation to that? Either direction you want to talk about it, whatever flows most naturally.
Okay, yeah. Our family, like to start with our family, we were pretty conservative and we were living in this conservative, what I would consider a rural town in Idaho. There's obviously smaller towns in Idaho than where we were, but we were homeschooling our kids and we were very, very active in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who most people would recognize more as the Mormons or the LDS Church. And life looked pretty good. We fit into that little bubble. We fit into that little box. We had, everything was safe and predictable and protective and all of those sorts of things. Obviously, I'm unable to share the perspective of my kid, but I do have blanket permission to share the story. But everything's coming right from the mom's perspective at the time.
Right. And the coming out story is your son's story. So
yeah,
that would be his to tell.
Yep. Right. So I'll only speak to my experience inside of that story. Basically, he was like a really good kid, just like nothing rebellious about him. Like I said, we were homeschooling. He was this ideal big brother, piggybacking his little siblings all over the house. They played hide and seek. Something intuitive about him was just good. Like if I went to the grocery store, he wouldn't let me carry in any of the bags, even though he was young, right? Like he was going to help me with those sorts of things. He was just a good kid. But starting about the age of 12, he was getting kind of angsty, kind of pouty and heavy. Like he was always like kind of moping around and tromping, for lack of a better word. And we were dumb, naive, first time parents or whatever. And we would talk to each other and be like, oh, that's that teenage angst we've heard about. That's, what you kind of adore. And he would say things like, I wish I didn't even have to be alive. And we were genuinely too naive to even hear what he was telling us, right? We just kept blaming it on like, oh, that's how teenagers talk and teenagers are moody. And we just have to fight to keep loving him for a few more years and he'll outgrow it or whatever. And by the time he was 16, it was almost like two people. Like he was this good, totally just like happy, helpful, loving, good kid. But there was always like this undercurrent of like we were homeschooling, but he was doing college level courses. And when I would try to talk to him about like, hey, you're taking calculus and quantum physics, maybe you could take those at the local university and get credit for it. And he'd be like, there's no reason to even care about the future. There's no reason to talk about college. So it's kind of like this dichotomy all the time that we just blamed on hormones. But I think most parents would relate when you get those like instinctual moments at the time. I would have referred to it as inspiration to like head on up to his room and have a conversation. It was time for the mom talk. So I trumped up. I honestly thought I was being inspired to talk to him about his video game playing because he played a lot of video games. And so I plopped down on his floor, leaned up against the wall, and I was just kind of shooting in the dark, trying to figure out what I needed to talk to him about. And he was uncharacteristically like angsty. He was pacing around, even though I was seated on the floor. He was pacing back and forth and back and forth. And finally, I said something like, it feels like you want to do something, like something bad or naughty or whatever, but you don't want the consequences of doing that. And he told me, yeah, you're exactly right. I do. And out of nowhere, out of my mouth, it didn't stop in my brain first.
It just erupted.
Right? So I must have known on some level, but never consciously. Out of my mouth, I asked, are you gay? And then the thoughts did come to my brain after, and I thought, what sort of a mother would ask their child this question? It was like, I thought it was some sort of an insult, or he wasn't stereotypical, like I wasn't insulting his mannerisms or whatever. I just did not know where it came from, except now I'm like, it's because mom knows. No. Like I was on some sort of level I knew.
Well, right. And now you know that like being gay isn't insulting, but
No.
like in the culture that you were living in that little Mormon bubble,
right?
Like, where did this come from?
Yeah. Like I felt like I was asking him, like, are you a pedophile? Or, some horrible insult like that. Like what sort of a mom would ask that? But he froze and he stared at me, these big giant eyes, and his eyes filled up with tears. And he didn't say anything. Like he just stared at me with these big giant eyes. And I said, this isn't the sort of thing I can guess at. I'm going to need you to answer that question. But he couldn't talk. So like there just weren't any words. He had been holding it in for so long. And so he crawled over to his desk and scrawled the word yes on this little corner scrap of paper and handed it to me. And honestly, it wasn't legible. Nobody could have read that piece of paper, but I knew what it said. And the part that's most vivid in my own memory with my own experience, he was tall. He was over 6 feet tall, and he probably weighed maybe 110 pounds, just this long, skinny 16-year-old kid. He was kneeling up on his knees, and I went over and I hugged him. And I said, I honestly don't even know what this means. I don't know what we're going to do about this, but I love you intensely. And whatever happens, we're on the same team. We're going to work it out together. And we spent the next couple hours with his head on my lap. I went back and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, and he put his head on my lap. And for about 2 hours, I just played with his hair. And he sobbed, and his whole body just kind of was shaking, like he had just completed this intense workout. And I just kept trying to keep breathing. And I had no idea what to do. I had no concept. In my head, I kept thinking, all I could think of was Anderson Cooper, Ellen DeGeneres. Anderson Cooper, Ellen DeGeneres. That's all
high profile famous gay people. Yep.
I had nobody to, I just was in this world where it just didn't even exist in my world. I wasn't campaigning politically against gay people. He had a teacher that we were pretty sure was gay back in second grade. Best teacher ever, loved him. I had nothing. There was so much ignorance. I didn't know what to do with it. But the turning point for me was the next morning. And I was in the kitchen. He had 3 younger siblings. And I was in the kitchen making breakfast. And he skipped through the kitchen, skipped. And he had been so sullen and grumpy for 4 years. And the morning after and then we told his dad after that, but the morning after he skipped, he was so, I don't even know that he noticed he was skipping. He was just so light, in his whole body. And I realized how heavy it had been for him and how freeing it was to just simply know that we loved him. So that's kind of the coming out story. And that's when I started hunting. He was not ready to be out publicly. So I was stuck trying to find anything that looked like resources to raise this kid. And and there wasn't anything. I ended up on this is embarrassing, but the Huffington Post had a gay voices section.
Yep.
And I was in the comment section under a fake name, just trying to ask questions. But I was so ignorant that I was just offending people. There wasn't a way for me to be well, what if he still wants to marry a girl without me getting pummeled, right? Because what a horrible question. But I didn't care. I took all the shots and I just didn't care. I just needed some information. And then shortly after, he still had not come out publicly yet, but I found the Mama Dragons on Facebook. There were about 20 of them, and they had just opened a Facebook group. And that was so pivotal for me to have that support. Up to that, we just loved him, and we didn't know what else to do.
And to me, that seems like such a no-brainer. Your kid is still your kid after they come out.
Right.
That's still the same person. And in fact, your son was happier.
Oh, yeah. He was fine.
After he came out, he was healthier the next day than he was the night before. And probably, by all accounts, for the previous 4 years.
Oh, 100%. Yes.
I didn't come out publicly till I was 31, but I had been coming out to various people since I was 19. So it was a process.
Yeah.
And just not having to hide and not having to worry about who knew and who didn't, and trying to remember who I'd already told, and being free from that anxiety and that fear and that hiding is so liberating.
Oh, so he was doing awesome. And we had no problems with him. Instantly I knew all of the weird conceptions I had in my head were wrong. Instantly. I just didn't know what else there was. I knew I needed to have the mom talk with him about safe sex. I had no idea what that would look like.
I mean, you need to have that talk with your kids anyway. You just didn't have
we had the wrong
context.
One.
Yeah.
We had the wrong one for all those years.
Right.
And I didn't know. It's interesting when I think backwards, because you don't think of yourself as ignorant in any given moment. But I was so absolutely ignorant. I had all these fears in my head of senators in airport bathrooms with young boys and like.
Well, the senator, the rep you just made a reference to, it was an Idaho senator.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Yes, the one in the Minneapolis airport bathroom, that whole scandal.
I knew it was in the Midwest, but I didn't know it was Idaho.
So it was an Idaho senator.
I didn't know that.
Who got arrested in the Minneapolis airport for soliciting sex in a bathroom.
Yeah, like those were the things I thought I knew about.
Right.
And I had heard like really badly interpreted stories of like Matthew Shepard,
right.
where he was kind of vilified and, you know, he was kind of asking for it or whatever, and taking deep dives into the actual story behind those things and having to absorb how dangerous the world might actually be for my kid. Those were the kind of things that I needed help and support for. He was fine. He was perfect. We just didn't know how to change the world. That's what I needed, was the entire world to change, especially in this little Mormon bubble that you referenced. Yeah. Like I brought up Matthew Shepard. And when I learned that the people who had actually treated him so brutally and so inhuman, it was like just disgusting and repulsive. Those were members of my church. Yeah. We shared a faith. And their community that stood behind them, those were members of my faith, which just skyrocketed my fear to outer space for how our community, everything that had felt that I mentioned before was like safe and beautiful and comfortable, I knew was not going to be safe and beautiful and comfortable for this kid.
Right. So that's kind of where the Mama Dragons come in, because that started as a group of mothers from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Yes?
Yeah, originally everybody was actively participating in the Mormon Church.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit about the Mama Dragons and who they are and what they have done for you and what they do for other people?
Yeah. So we're a decade later, right? So things are more developed, but the mission of the organization itself is to support, educate, and empower the mothers of LGBTQ kids. So at this point, probably, this is a random guess, I haven't looked at numbers for a long time, but probably about 30% of the group is associated actually with the LDS or Mormon Church in any way. But our roots definitely started there. And so the assumption from the start was that you have telling moms, right, just love your kid. It's such a ridiculous statement, because that's not the problem. They already do. We just have all these weird. So when you hear about kids getting kicked out, or whatever, which is very real and very horrible, it isn't a lack of love that's kicking those kids out to the street. It's like this weird culture that we grew up in the 80s with tough love, where being gay is a choice. And if you want your kid to choose something better, you can't enable their bad choices. Where if you think about being a lesbian as being like a heroin addict and apply those same principles that you would for someone you deeply loved. And so it's like literally just a lack of education that's causing the majority of these problems. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't.
No, it's completely backwards.
Like, yes, I hear what you are saying and I understand your words, but no, it doesn't make sense. It's completely bonkers.
Yeah, because you can't bully someone into not being gay anymore, right? Like that's.
Well, and you can't bully someone into not being an addict either.
No, but
like that also doesn't work.
Like that whole tough love thing from the 80s.
Yeah. Yep.
And figuring out that those things don't work. Like that's where a lot of us are coming from. So the majority of our moms and Mama Dragons are coming from conservative cultures, whether it's conservative religion or just conservative areas of the country, where they have heard horrible lies and misconceptions about queer people their whole lives. And they become terrified that their child is going to turn into those lies and misconceptions. Right. So like we could look at Jackson and he was like the perfect kid in my eyes. Right. And I didn't worry about that because the chances of him harming another person, never going to happen. Like I just knew this kid so deeply. So that's why all those misconceptions fell apart for me, like in that single moment. But we know statistically that a lot of queer kids who are closeted that are deeply struggling, because being closeted is miserable.
Agreed.
Their mental health is suffering. They start participating in self-harming and self-damaging activities. So by the time some of these kids are coming out, they have been experimenting with drugs. they have been engaging in risky sexual behaviors that are like with wild age differences, or potentially even getting paid for such things. There's this idea that they're inside themselves, that they've internalized that they're disgusting, that they're broken, that they're damaged. And so they treat themselves that way. So then by the time these kids come out to their parents, for the parents, it's just one more bad choice, right? That the kid has made. And I can see how parents are thinking this, even though they're so desperately wrong about, like the self-harming behavior didn't cause the gay.
Right.
Like it's backwards. And so we try really hard to teach what good parents actually do and what actually takes your kids out of those spaces.
Right. And I attended a PFLAG meeting that you were leading specifically about what accepting and rejecting behavior looks like from the perspective of a developing teenage brain.
Yeah.
And that was so powerful because at the time I was teaching middle school and high school, and to read some of those behaviors, like the things that parents think are like, of course I accept my kid, but because teenagers, their brains are different than adult brains, things that parents think are accepting are often perceived as rejecting behaviors by teenagers. And when you think about a kid who's already angsty because of hormones and their brain developing, and then on top of it, they're coming out or they are closeted and they're wrestling with all of this. And then you add the teenage egocentrism and everybody hates me, everyone's looking at me. Why is everything so hard? And you add a parental comment or behavior on top of it that was meant to be one thing but is perceived another way because of all of that very teenage developmentally normal baggage.
Yeah, Dr. Caitlin Ryan from San Francisco State University has done some pretty intensive evidence-based research. She's won lots of awards for it, and it is genius. And it's so interesting when you look at the behaviors, because you're like, no parent would do that. Like, that is horrible, these rejecting behaviors. But then in the real world, you see it happen all the time, like different cultures with high machismo levels. Like culturally, if your son is acting a little feminine, the way to fix that is to make sure that his brothers are beating him up a lot, because that's going to toughen him up, right? Like that's like a cultural thing that these families grow up thinking, where obviously if your kid is feminine, you should not beat them up. Seems like it would be really obvious. Or I worked with teens forever and they would say things like, my parents are super affirming. They just don't want me to act gay. And I'd be like, what does that mean to you to act gay? And he's like, like sometimes I pop my hip out when I'm standing and I need to not do that. And so these parents are telling their children unintentionally, the way you exist in society is offensive and problematic. And so you need to fix yourself, when the parents are genuinely trying to say, I do not want you to get beat up. I do not want you to get bullied. Here's what I'm going to do to try to protect you. And it doesn't work. It's wrong. But you can, when you hear it from the parents' perspective and stuff, you can be like, oh, I get what you were trying to do. And also, let me explain to you why it failed.
Yeah. And this is what your kid is actually hearing from you.
Yeah. Like if someone was saying to you, like, oh, I really genuinely love you, but the way you smile, awkward. Please don't, please stop laughing like that. Those messages don't feel like
I've
love,
actually
right?
heard that. Your laugh is too loud. I know. I'm sorry.
Right. That's just how it comes out.
I'm a theater kid. It happens.
Right. So they start repressing and internalizing these messages that like all of these characteristics about me that are just innate are offensive to other people. And it's really, really damaging. And it's damaging to the parent-child relationship.
Mm-hmm. So Mama Dragons exists to help educate parents on not just you need to love your kids, because parents in an ideal world inherently love their kids, but this is what loving behavior looks like in a situation where you have an LGBTQ child.
And learning things like, for example, this is not me, but my child is trans and the school policies are really damaging. I don't know what to do. And then you have these 10,000 moms, some of which are attorneys and some of which work with Title IX professionally, some of which are in more liberal locations. And they can all say, here's what the law says. Here's what your child is entitled to. This is what you have the very absolute right to demand from this school system on behalf of your child. Sometimes we get in this world of gaslighting, right? Where they're like, I'm sorry, your child doesn't have any place to go to the bathroom. That's a personal problem or whatever, right? They put it back on the parents, and parents don't know. You don't know what you can fight for. So a lot of it is that kind of thing. How do I help my kid change their name? How do I deal with this bully situation? What do I do with grandma who refuses to acknowledge the reality of the new girlfriend in the family, or all of those kind of things? Just getting support. So you're like, wait, it's not me. I'm not crazy. This is real. And this is what we're entitled to expect in the world of, common decency and dignity.
Yeah. You mentioned that when your son came out, you were very involved and active in the LDS church.
Oh, yes.
10 years on, what does that look like? Is your family still involved in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
No. Our immediate family resigned from the church. And there's a ton I could say about the details of that. It took us probably a full year before we stopped participating, of just trying to sort it out. Essentially, I couldn't participate in a space that wasn't able to recognize the full humanity and equality of my child. And I know that is a space where a lot of members of the church get defensive. Like, of course we do. Of course we do. But theologically, it's not true, like within the depths of the theology. And I don't know how familiar you are with LDS theology. You lived in Idaho.
So. Yeah, I lived in Idaho for 13 years, and I have friends who are ex-Mormon for very much the same reasons you are. Some who are still like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Some who are kind of like trying to change it from the inside. They're like, this is the faith I grew up with. These are my people. This is my community. I would really like to, I believe a lot of this stuff, but I think the way we're doing it is wrong. And I know a little bit about theology. I don't know if that I would say I'm well-versed though.
Well, there's this basic underlying theology where the goal or the purpose, like the reason for my existence as a person on the planet, was to birth children and make sure all of them got back to the celestial kingdom with me, which is the highest level of heaven, right? That's the only reason I existed as a human, was to birth children and get them all back to the highest level of heaven. And when I realized I couldn't get my entire family there, like theologically, that was an impossibility. I had a pretty intense wrestle with God at the time. And I was like, fine, you know what? We're packing up the whole family and we're going to a lower level of heaven where we can be together. Because all of a sudden I recognized this sad heaven. Like, I'm in this highest level of heaven with 2 of my kids or 3 of my kids, and the other 2 aren't welcome. Like, that
is a very sad heaven.
Yeah. Like, I was like, that I'd rather go to the lower heaven myself, where at least we can be together. And I was like, yeah, wait, all of a sudden your heaven doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not even interested in going there anymore. And so I kind of started with those ideas, and then the younger siblings were coming home in tears. The youngest was 8 at the time. And then number 2 was 16, and they were coming home with messages from church. The 8-year-old would come home and cry and say things like, why don't they think that Jackson can go to heaven with us? And I would have to launch into this whole thing about, like, sometimes people are just wrong. And, and I was like, this is actually harming. This is more harmful than helpful. But we did study it out for about a year. And there's a lot of nuance. Like, if the church fully accepted queer people 1,000%, we wouldn't go back at this point.
Like, it's been a long time, and we have other reasons on top of our reasons. Yeah.
Once you move outside of a bubble, when you look back into the bubble, it's a little bit more objective than maybe when you were originally inside.
I mean, I imagine that was a really difficult year though, because you went to BYU. I mean, you and your husband met there. I mean, you grew up in Utah as a member of the church. I mean, that was your whole life.
Right. So my husband and I didn't actually meet at BYU.
Oh, okay.
It's worse. We met in seminary in high school.
Okay.
And then we attended BYU, and we actually graduated together the same day. With our 2-year-old on our hips.
Okay. So, like, did he leave on his mission and then come back, and then you got married? And so you did one of those. Okay.
Yes, we did. the whole kit and caboodle. And it worked for us. We had lived in 5 different states up to this point. And the LDS community the Mormons do so many things like within communities so well. And we just had this built-in family as we traveled around the world, and our kids had these built-in friends, or not the world, sorry, the country. And our kids had these built-in friends. And my husband's education and career were quite time-consuming. I had these built-in babysitters and the support network. I would say that the majority of my identity was only 2 things, like mom and Mormon. I didn't really have any other personal identity outside of those 2 things. And essentially, I felt forced to choose between those 2 identities. I couldn't be a good mom and continue to be a Mormon. I had to pick. And so I lost half of my identity. And I was old. I was way too old
to have to rebuild who you were.
Yep. Yeah, I was 40, and to also like everything in my head, like I was like, do I even like music? Did I even want to get married? Everything in my whole life suddenly had to be reevaluated because half of my existence didn't exist anymore. It was absolutely the hardest, hands down thing that I've ever gone through. There's a reason there's support groups for people who leave high demand religion.
Yeah, no kidding. Wow, that was really illuminating. Especially like you going on the Huffington, like thinking back to you going on the Huffington Post with a fake name and asking questions.
Right?
Like it definitely helps me understand how you are so patient with people online now who ask questions and possibly in bad faith, and how you engage with people so thoughtfully and kindly and
how could I judge people for
patiently?
ignorance when I was so amazingly ignorant?
Right. Like it's like, oh, that's how she does it.
Because they're like, every time I'm arguing with someone who's asking these just ridiculous questions, I'm like, oh, you're just me 10 years ago. I wasn't a bad person. I wasn't cruel. I was just completely undereducated.
Yeah. So at the beginning, I asked how you received care this week, and you were talking about like your month-long delves into various forms of self-care. During the time when you were reevaluating your identity and then continuing to now, how do you practice self but also community care?
Well, at the beginning, we lost our community.
Yeah.
Like suddenly my girls weren't allowed to play with friends anymore. Some were great. Some friends were great, but there were a lot that were like, you can't really come. My mom says you can't come to our house anymore. The people that I normally went to for advice and comfort were telling me things that intuitively I just knew were not true. Things like, you just need to make sure that he stays celibate, or you just need to make sure, there's camps you can send him to change him. Like, this was my support network. Obviously, I couldn't turn to them anymore, and I didn't know where to go. So at the beginning, there was no community care, and I did not do well. Like, full on, had a complete and total breakdown. I was medicated beyond medication limits. I lost probably 40 pounds in a couple months. Like, it just was not going well, which is probably why finding these Mama Dragons a year later was so essential for me, because then I could ask questions. Like, I'd be like, I feel like I know what I need to do for this kid, but what if I'm wrong? What if my choices are sending him to hell? Because I was terrified of that.
Right.
And, and then these loving moms who had been on the same path were like, oh, you're not wrong. Those instincts that you have are dead on. You're doing it right. And so I built care and community like that. Starting online. I had been in the group for, I had only met these moms online for maybe 4 or 5 weeks. And a couple of them had decided that they were going to go on a retreat in St. George together. And I was like, can I come? I'm not a person who invites myself places. But I was like, can I come? And they were like, yeah, we're all paying. Just send your money, to Jill. And I was like, great. I write a check. I mail it off. My husband thinks I've lost my mind. Right. He's like, wait, you just mailed money to who? I'm like, it's fine. It's internet mom. He's like, wait, you mailed money? What? And I was like, we're going to stay together in a house. And he was like, what if the whole thing, what if I go, our whole family goes, and we could rent a house, and then you could go in the daytime and then come back. Just like this idea
at night.
Right. This idea that I was launching myself, money and all, into these internet strangers that I had never met. In hindsight, I'm like, oh yeah, I get why he was a little bit like, wait, how much did you send? But I needed that so desperately. And we went for a week and I cried all day, every day, literally all day, every day, because I finally found people who got it. And that need for community and sisterhood was so intense. I went around to each one of them. There were like 17 people who were there. I went around to each one. I was like, okay, tell me your story. Tell me your story. And I would just listen and weep. And then I would find the next one. I stayed up to 4 a.m. every night, just like soaking in. And that's when I started to rebuild community, and why I think community is so crazy essential. Why the queer community needs a community where they can be safe and away, and why the Black community or the deaf community or the trans community needs people who get it, where you can just let your guard down and be yourself and be surrounded with that community. So that's like, I have like these passionate ideas about community now, because I went for like a solid year from having community to losing it and then rebuilding it again.
That is a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much. Because I agree. I mean, we need our spaces where we can just be.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not have to be justifying or defending or having to like convince people that we should exist.
Right. Exactly.
So thank you so much for being here. What is the Mama Dragon's website for people who would like to check them out or who potentially need to join?
It's mamadragons.org. So super simple. The hardest part is getting people to spell mama in the same way. So it's M-A-M-A. Mama Dragons.
Mamadragons.org. That's M-A-M-A dragons.org. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Hoorf. To view the complete show notes and all the links mentioned in today's episode, or to get a full transcript of the episode, visit hoorfpodcast.com. That's H-O-O-R-F podcast.com. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you can receive new episodes right when they're released. And if you're enjoying our podcast, I'd love to have you leave us a review in Apple Podcasts. Reviews are one of the major ways that Apple ranks their podcasts, so even though it only takes you a few seconds, it really does make a difference for us. Become a patron. For $3 a month, you can support the creation of this podcast, pay my editor, and join a community of fellow caregivers out here just doing our best. Thank you again for joining me, Elle Billing, in this episode of Hoorf. Until next time, be excellent to each other. Hoorf is hosted by Elle Billing at Elle and Wink. Audio editing by Ricky Cummings at Ricky Poo. Music composed by Ricky Cummings. Hoorf is a production of Elle and Wink Art Studio, all rights reserved. Hoorf Podcast can be found on social media channels at Hoorf Podcast, at HOORF Podcast.